The Duke did not enter rooms. He conquered them. By the winter of 1819, half of London whispered Cédric Vale's name with fear and the other half with hunger. Men crossed streets to avoid him. Women who swore they hated him still watched every ballroom door when midnight approached. 4 years earlier, society buried the Blackthorn name beside the ashes of a ruined estate and declared the last duke finished. They were wrong. Cédric returned richer than war, colder than grief, and dangerous enough to make powerful men nervous. Tonight, someone inside the palace plans to destroy him forever. Watch closely. Nothing in this story survives untouched. Snow-hammered Blackthorn House, while Cédric sat alone in the library with a ledger under one hand and a blood-stained cloth pressed against his ribs. The cut annoyed him more than the pain did, not because the wound was shallow, it wasn't, but because being cut at all meant someone had gotten close enough to try, and that meant he'd miscalculated something, and Cédric Vale did not miscalculate. He catalogued the air the same way he catalogued everything, without sentiment, without excuse, with the cold efficiency of a man who understood that self-pity was just another word for slow death. 5 ships from Marseille, 3 delayed in Portsmouth, 1 missing weapons shipment replaced with sandbags. The ledger numbers lined up correctly on every page except the one that mattered, which told him what he already knew. Someone was stealing from him again. Not a clerk making arithmetic errors. Someone with access to the manifests, the docking schedules, and the patience to replace cargo without triggering inspection flags. That level of operation required either institutional knowledge or institutional protection. In London, in 1819, those two things were usually the same thing. He pressed harder on the cloth and turned another page. The fire behind him had burned low. He hadn't moved to tend it in over an hour. Cold didn't trouble him anymore. Not the cold of drafty English winters, not the cold of sleeping on frozen ground with nothing between him and the earth but a dead man's coat. He'd spent 3 years in circumstances that reduced most men to either savagery or breakdown, and what it had reduced him to was something harder to name and considerably more difficult to kill. He had learned, somewhere in the space between surviving and returning, that comfort was not a requirement. Comfort was a preference, and preferences were leverage waiting to be used against you. A hard knock interrupted the silence. "Come in." Lucien Graves stepped inside, covered in snow and bruises. He was a big man, made bigger by the cold weather coat, but the bruises changed his proportions in ways that suggested someone had worked on him methodically rather than in anger. Cédric noted the split lip, the swollen orbital bone above the left eye, the careful way Lucien held his right shoulder. 3 points of damage, distributed, not a street fight, an interrogation that ended badly for the interrogators. "You look terrible," Cédric said. "You sound emotional," Lucien said. "I sound accurate." Lucien moved further into the room and tossed a folded paper onto the desk without sitting down, which meant he either couldn't or didn't want to. Cédric unfolded it slowly. Edgar Rowe, Dock Foreman. 3rd Pier, Southwark. Throat slit with a military-grade blade, tongue removed post-mortem. The report was written in the clipped, bloodless language of someone who had filed too many of these in too short a time. "Same mark?" Cédric asked. "Silver nail, left palm." The room fell quiet, except for the dying fire. Cédric set the paper down and leaned back slowly, which pulled at the wound in his ribs in ways that required genuine concentration not to show on his face. He stared into the fire for a long moment, not from grief. Edgar Rowe had worked Blackthorn's docks for 6 years, had a wife and 4 children in Bermondsey, had never asked for more than fair wages and a dry roof, had never once given Cédric cause to distrust him. That wasn't grief exactly. It was the arithmetic of obligation, and Cédric understood obligation better than most emotions. "You know who's behind this," Lucien muttered. It wasn't a question. "No," Cédric said quietly, "but I know who taught them." Lucien didn't press it, one of his rare qualities, that restraint. Most men who worked for Cédric eventually developed the habit of filling silence with words, as though silence were itself a kind of accusation. Lucien had learned years ago that silence in Cédric's presence was simply silence. It didn't require management. He slid a black envelope across the table instead. Thick paper. Royal seal pressed in wax, the color of old blood. Cédric looked at it without touching it for a moment. "The Crown suddenly remembers I exist," he said. "The Crown remembers your money exists," Lucicia said. "And your shipping routes. And the fact that 3 cabinet ministers owe you debts they'd rather not have discussed publicly. Who else is attending? Lucien was quiet for just a beat too long. Kedrick noticed. Who else, Lucien? And the Ravenshire family. He said it the way a man announces bad weather. Factually. Apologetically. As though the weather were somehow his fault, Kedrick's fingers tightened around the envelope. 3 years. 3 years since Evelyn Ravenshire had stood in the garden of her father's estate and looked at him the way you look at something you're surrendering rather than choosing. 3 years since she'd chosen Lord Aldrich Morrow instead. Old money, political connections, a family name that could shield the Ravenshires from the creditors and the social damage her father's gambling had accumulated like compound interest. 3 years since that husband had died under circumstances that the coroner's report described as heart failure, and that half of London described with more creative vocabulary. Kedrick had not been responsible for Morrow's death. He wanted that stated clearly in his own interior record, not because it troubled him morally. What troubled him about that situation had nothing to do with Morrow, but because precision mattered. A man who kept inaccurate accounts of his own actions eventually lost the ability to distinguish between what he'd done and what he was capable of doing, and Kedrick had spent too much time in the company of men who'd made that particular error to find it romantic. You all right? Lucien asked. No, Kedrick said. He stood, the pain in his ribs flaring through his chest in a long hot line as he crossed to the credenza and grabbed the whiskey bottle. He poured one glass, considered it, poured another. Tell me about the body, the actual scene, not the report. Lucien obliged. Military knife work. The cut pattern on Roe's throat was too precise for common violence, too economical. The tongue removal was a message, not a trophy. Someone telling the remaining dock workers that speech had consequences. The silver nail was driven through the left palm, not hammered, which meant whoever left it had brought a prepositioned tool and enough composure to use it carefully in the middle of a murder scene. That was either professional discipline or pathology, or most dangerously both. He had a wife, Kedrick said. 4 kids, Lucien said. 2 youngest are still in school. Find them. Settle every debt they carry. Tuition, rent, whatever Roe owed the pawnbrokers. Do it through the charity trust so it can't be traced back directly. I already did, Lucien said. Before I came here. Kedrick looked at him. Lucien had anticipated the instruction and executed it before reporting in. There was something in that fact that Kedrick found more affecting than he cared to examine. Not sentiment exactly, more like the recognition of shared moral syntax, the understanding that some obligations didn't require discussion. Good, Kedrick said. Lucien studied him for a long moment with the careful attention of someone who had watched Kedrick veil for long enough to read the negative space. What wasn't said? What wasn't shown? People say you came back from the continent without a soul, he said finally. Kedrick gave a humorless smile. No. I came back with too much of it. He swallowed the second whiskey and set the glass down. That's the actual problem. After Lucien left, Kedrick sat back down at the desk and did not move for a long time. The fire died to embers. The snow outside the windows had thickened into something past weather and approaching siege. He eventually retrieved the needle and thread from the desk drawer. He kept them there the way other men kept letter openers, and removed his shirt without ceremony. The wound was longer than he'd initially assessed, 3 inches, diagonal, starting below the 7th rib. Clean cut. Professional work. Whoever had gotten close enough to do it in the dark alley behind the Aldgate warehouse had known where to stand and how to hold the blade, which told him the attack had been orchestrated well in advance by someone familiar with his habits and his roots and his tendency to conduct certain business personally, rather than delegating it to men who asked too many questions. That was a short list. Narrowing it was a matter of patience. He threaded the needle, poured whiskey on the wound without flinching, not because he was performing stoicism for an audience, but because there was no audience and the flinching cost him nothing either way. He began stitching with the focused attention of someone doing fine mechanical work. Needle, thread, pull. The pain arrived in clean, regular pulses, which he found preferable to the diffuse, relentless ache of injuries that couldn't be addressed. Pain that could be addressed was just a task. It was in the space between stitches that his mind moved toward Evelyn, despite everything he'd taught himself about that particular direction. He had developed, over 3 years, a fairly sophisticated architecture of avoidance. He knew which thoughts were gateway thoughts. Small, apparently innocuous memories that led reliably downward into territory he had no use for. The color of a particular evening light, the way certain silences felt before she filled them. The last thing she'd said to him before the wedding. She'd come to find him herself. That was the part he hadn't expected. He'd thought he would simply receive word through channels. An announcement in the papers, a formal withdrawal of understanding, the social machinery of rejection operating at its customary remove. Instead, she'd appeared in the doorway of his study at 11 in the evening, with her hands clasped in front of her, and her face doing the specific thing faces do when they're working hard not to do anything at all. "I think marrying you destroys my family," she'd said. Not, "I don't love you." Not, "I've made my choice, and it has nothing to do with you." She'd said it like a hypothesis being tested aloud, like she was still deciding whether it was true, and had decided to let him hear her arrive at the conclusion in real time. He had looked at her for a long moment and said nothing, and then she had left, and 3 weeks later she was married to Aldrich Morrow in a ceremony that half of London attended, and that Kaedric spent aboard a ship off the coast of Calais, reading ship manifests and making notes in the margins. That sentence stayed longer than bullets ever had. He tied off the last stitch and sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling for a while. He was 31 years old. He had fought in 2 military campaigns, survived a financial ruin that had destroyed lesser men outright, built a trading empire from almost nothing in 4 years, and acquired the kind of reputation that preceded him into rooms in ways that made negotiation considerably simpler. He was, by any objective measurement, formidable. He was also, in the privacy of his own interior, precisely as damaged as the things that had made him formidable. He understood this without sentimentality. It was just another entry in the ledger. He went upstairs near midnight, and the halls of Blackthorn House received him the way they always did, with the particular silence of a place that had been built for more people than currently occupied it. His father had filled these halls with something, not warmth. Duke Adrian Vale hadn't been capable of warmth in any conventional sense, but he'd filled them with presence, with the constant low-frequency atmospheric pressure of a man who needed to be accounted for at all times. After his death and the ruin and Kaedric's departure, the house had gone quiet in a way that felt less like peace and more like held breath. He paused briefly in front of his father's portrait at the end of the second-floor corridor, as he occasionally did, not from filial sentiment but from the same impulse that made him return periodically to examine old wounds, checking whether they'd taught him what they were supposed to. Duke Adrian Vale stared down from the canvas with the pleasant expression of a man accustomed to being painted and the dead eyes of someone who had decided, at some early point, that most human beings were obstacles or instruments. He'd been handsome in the way that men who understand their own handsomeness become something else over time. The jaw strong, the brow composed, the mouth arranged into the suggestion of authority rather than warmth. "You're weak," his father had told him regularly, in various formulations, delivered in the measured tone of a man conveying a medical diagnosis rather than an insult. "You care about things you can't control. That's the definition of weakness." He'd said it when Kaedric was 11 and defended a stable boy who'd been falsely accused of theft. He'd said it when Kaedric was 16 and spent 3 weeks visiting a tenant farmer's family through a bad fever season. He'd said it when Kaedric was 20 and asked once whether the financial decisions that were quietly destroying the estate might be reconsidered. The war had taught Kaedric something more complicated. His father had been right about the world. The world was, in fact, cold and indifferent, and populated with people who would use every available vulnerability against you. What his father had been wrong about was survival. Adrian Vale's method, cauterize everything, hold nothing, invest in no one, had produced a man who died alone in a financially ruined house with no allies willing to attend the funeral in any but a social obligation capacity. Kedrick's method was different. It looked similar from the outside, but internally it operated on a different principle. He didn't eliminate caring. He weaponized it. He cared with extraordinary precision, very rarely, toward very specific people. And that care produced in those people a loyalty that no amount of money could reliably purchase. Lucian settling Rose's family debts before he'd even been asked. That was the product of the method. That was what passed in Kaedric's architecture for love. He turned away from the portrait and moved toward his bedroom. The metallic sound stopped him at the door. It was small, barely audible. The kind of sound that most people would attribute to the house settling or the wind working at old window frames, and that Kaedric's nervous system, recalibrated by years of environments where small sounds were frequently the last warning available, flagged as immediate. He stood without moving, breathing carefully, extending his attention outward into the dark corridor. The house was silent around him, but the silence had texture now, the quality of occupied silence rather than empty silence. Another sound from the balcony outside his bedroom, this one unmistakable. Weight shifting on stone. His hand moved to the pistol beneath his coat with the automatic efficiency of reflex that had bypassed conscious thought entirely. He crossed the last 10 feet to his bedroom door in silence, moving along the wall rather than the center of the corridor, reaching the door without touching the hinges, pressing it inward with his fingertips. The bedroom was dark. The curtains over the balcony door moved slightly, not from drafts, the windows were closed, but from something on the other side pressing against them. Someone on the other side. Standing very still, which meant either experienced tradecraft or paralysis, and Kaedric's read of the weight distribution and how the curtain moved suggested the latter. He crossed the room in 4 steps and pulled the curtain open sharply with the pistol leveled. A woman stood on the balcony in the snow. Dark cloak, hood down, hair plastered against her face from the storm. The cloak was stained with blood. Not spray, not drops, but the long, soaking stains of someone who had been either injured or in very close proximity to someone who was. Her hands were raised, not in the performance of surrender, but in the instinctive lifting of hands that belongs to genuine terror. Her eyes found the pistol barrel and then found his face. He hadn't seen her in 3 years. She was thinner, not fragile. Evelyn Ravenshire had never been fragile, not in the ways that mattered, but worn down in the way that people get when something has been requiring enormous amounts of them for an extended period. Her eyes were the same. That was the unsettling part. Everything else about her face had learned how to be different, had acquired the composure of a widow in a society that had very specific requirements for how widows conducted themselves. But her eyes had not learned the new performance yet, or had abandoned it in the current emergency, and what was in them was the raw, unmediated fear of someone who was very far past the point of managing impressions. Kaedric did not lower the pistol immediately. He stood there in the doorway between his bedroom and his balcony, in the snow and the dark, looking at the woman who had told him 3 years ago that loving him was a structural liability, and he conducted an extremely rapid internal audit of what he was feeling, which was several things simultaneously in a stack that required sorting. Shock, which he dismissed as irrelevant to the present situation. An anger that was old and architectural and could not be addressed right now. And underneath those, immediate and practical, the blood on the cloak was still wet. She had not come from very far away. Whatever had happened recently. She was breathing in the shallow, rapid pattern of someone in acute stress. Her hands were still up. "Evelyn," he said. His voice came out flat, controlled. The voice he used in situations where maintaining a specific register was itself a form of action. Her lips moved. The wind took part of it. He stepped closer, still holding the pistol because he was not an idiot, and because 3 years and an unannounced blood-stained appearance on his balcony at midnight did not automatically reinstate trust regardless of how her eyes looked at him. Close enough to hear. She said the 6 words that changed everything. "They're going to kill the king." He looked at her for 2 full seconds. Not from shock, or not only from shock, but from the specific cognitive process of a man taking a very large piece of information and running it against everything he already knew as fast as the mind allows. The silver nails, the missing weapons shipment, the royal invitation arrived 3 days earlier than protocol required. Rose tongue removed because of what he'd heard, not what he'd done. Kaedric lowered the pistol. "Get inside," he said. She crossed the threshold and he followed her in, closing the balcony door behind them and pulling the curtains fully shut. The bedroom was cold. He hadn't lit the fire. And she stood in the center of it, dripping snowmelt onto the carpet, arms wrapped around herself now that the performance of raised hands was no longer required, looking like someone who had been operating on pure emergency fuel for long enough that the tank was nearly empty. He looked at the blood on the cloak. "Are you hurt?" "Not mine," she said. Her voice was steadier than her eyes. He filed that away. "Whose?" She looked at him then with an expression he couldn't immediately categorize, which was unusual. He was generally good at categorizing expressions. This one had something in it he hadn't seen from her before. Not quite guilt, not quite appeal. Something that existed in the territory between "I need you" and "I know what this costs." "His name was Thomas Anvers," she said. "He was a footman in the sovereign household. He found something he wasn't supposed to find, and he came to me because he didn't know who else to trust, and they killed him on my doorstep 4 hours ago." Kaedric was quiet for a moment. They killed him on your doorstep. Yes. Which means they know you know. Yes. He turned away from her then and walked to the window, not because he needed to look at anything outside, but because he needed 4 seconds without her looking at him while he organized the next several hours. The Winter Sovereign Ball was in 2 days. Whatever was planned for the king was timed to the ball. It was the only event in the calendar that put the king in a predictable location with a predictable schedule surrounded by the kind of security apparatus that could be infiltrated by someone with sufficient institutional access. The missing weapons, the silver nail killings that tracked along the docks where certain cargo moved, something had been in motion for months. He had been seeing fragments of it without recognizing the shape. He turned back to Evelyn. "What did Anvers tell you?" "He had a letter," she said. "A letter from someone in the treasury with a signature I recognized." "Whose signature?" She held his gaze with the specific steadiness of someone delivering information they know is a grenade. "Lord Harcastle," she said, "your father's oldest friend. The man who managed the Blackthorn estate accounts in the 2 years before the ruin." The silence in the room became a different kind of silence. Kedrick's father's friend. The man who had wept at Adrian Vale's funeral. One of the only people who had. The man who had sent Kedrick a formal letter of condolence after the estate's financial collapse, expressing sorrow he could now understand as something other than grief. The man who had, for 30 years, occupied the impeccable position of trusted family advisor, which was precisely the position from which you could hollow out the foundations of a financial empire without triggering inspection flags. The ruined estate, the sandbags in the weapons crate, the dock foreman with his tongue removed. "Where's the letter now?" Kedrick said. Evelyn's face shifted in a way that told him before she spoke. "Anvers had it on his person," she said. "When they killed him, they took it. So we have no evidence." "We have me," she said. "I read it." He looked at her for a long moment. A woman who had fled a murder scene and appeared on his balcony covered in a dead man's blood, carrying verbal testimony about a conspiracy letter that no longer existed, implicating one of the most politically connected men in England in a plot against the king. No letter. No corroboration. No physical evidence. Her word. Outside, the storm had intensified. The wind pressed against the windows in long, sustained pushes, and somewhere below in the street, Kedrick heard the sound of horses moving in a pattern that didn't belong to weather or late-night traffic. He crossed to the edge of the curtain and looked through the gap without disturbing it. 3 riders, moving slowly past the front of Blackthorn House, not stopping, not accelerating, moving at the deliberate pace of men cataloging rather than searching, taking inventory of a location rather than raiding it. One of them glanced up at the upper windows as he passed. Kedrick let the curtain fall. He turned to find Evelyn watching him with the expression of someone who already knows what he's just seen. "How long have they been following you?" he said. "I don't know," she said. "Since the doorstep. Maybe longer." The riders made a second pass. Kedrick heard them clearly now, even through the storm. They weren't leaving, which meant that within the next hour, someone considerably more senior than 3 outriders was going to make a decision about Blackthorn House. And when that decision was made, everything that followed was going to move very fast, and there would be no recovering from mistakes. He looked at Evelyn Ravenshire standing in the center of his bedroom in a blood-soaked cloak with no evidence and no allies and nowhere else to have gone. 3 years. 3 years since she'd told him he was too expensive to love. He said the only thing that made sense in a situation where sentiment was a luxury neither of them could afford. "You're going to tell me everything, every word of that letter, every name, every figure, in the next 20 minutes. He moved to the fireplace and started building the fire with quick, efficient movements. "After that, we're not discussing Anvers, the letter, or what you saw. We're discussing how to keep both of us alive long enough to do anything about it." She watched him. "And then what?" "And then," he said, striking the flint, "we go to the ball." The fire caught. Light spread through the room and found the angles of her face and the blood drying on her cloak, and the 3 riders passing for the 3rd time in the street below. And somewhere in the palace across the city, a man whose signature she had read in a dead footman's letter was making his own calculations about timelines and loose ends. One of those loose ends had just made the worst mistake available to her. She'd brought her problems to the one man in England who had more reason than anyone to want Harcastle destroyed. She hadn't brought them to a protector. She'd brought them to a weapon. Evelyn talked for 18 minutes. Kedrick did not interrupt her once. He sat in the chair beside the newly built fire with his elbows on his knees and his hands loose between them, and his face arranged into the specific neutrality of a man who has trained himself to receive information without contaminating it with reaction. She stood for the first several minutes, then sat on the edge of the bed because her legs had apparently decided they'd done enough for one evening, and she talked in the careful, precise way of someone who has been mentally rehearsing a testimony they weren't sure they'd ever get to deliver. The letter had been 3 pages. She'd read it twice because the first time she hadn't believed what she was reading, and the second time she'd read it slowly enough to memorize the structure, if not every word. Lord Harcastle had written it to a man identified only by initials, R.V., in the language of financial correspondence that had been retrofitted to carry a different cargo entirely. Disbursement schedules that didn't correspond to any legitimate treasury operation. Movement authorizations for cargo described in categories that civilian administrators didn't typically handle. And at the bottom of the second page, a timeline. 3 dates. The first 2 already passed. The third was the night of the Winter Sovereign Ball. Did it specify method? Kadrick asked. No. It specified access. She looked at him steadily. Someone inside the palace guard. Someone who has been in position for at least 8 months. RV, Kadrick said. I don't know who that is. I might. He stood and moved to the writing desk, pulling open the lower left drawer and removing a small leather-bound notebook that he carried no personal sentimentality about, but that contained certain categories of information he preferred not to commit to correspondence. He turned pages without explaining what he was looking for. The weapons shipment that was replaced with sandbags came through a routing authorization signed by a deputy attaché named Roland Voss. He's been in the Sovereign Household Staff Administration for 9 months. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. That's a very specific piece of information to have readily available. I make it a practice to know where my cargo goes when it doesn't arrive, Kadrick said. Voss has been on a list for 6 weeks. I assumed he was working a private theft operation. I underestimated the scale. He closed the notebook. They looked at each other across the firelit room with 3 years and several complicated layers of unfinished business between them, and neither of them said any of it, because the men in the street had just made a 4th pass and the geometry of the situation did not currently have space for anything that wasn't tactical. You said Harcastle managed the Blackthorn estate accounts, Evelyn said. Before the ruin. For 2 years, yes. Were you aware of that at the time? Kadrick's jaw tightened very slightly. It was the only visible indication. No, I was 23 and on the continent, and my father had made arrangements he didn't discuss with me. By the time I returned, the estate was in terminal condition, and my father was 6 months from his death. He paused. The ruin was deliberate. I suspected it at the time. I had no evidence. Until now, she said. Until now, he agreed. She was looking at him with an expression he recognized better than he wanted to. It was the expression of someone recalculating, revising a structure they'd built around a set of facts that had just turned out to be incomplete. He knew what she was revising. He had no interest in facilitating it or accelerating it. Whatever she was arriving at, she could arrive at it on her own schedule and in her own privacy. He had a conspiracy to dismantle in approximately 48 hours and 2 unresolved problems. No evidence, and a house that was currently being surveilled by men whose employers he needed to identify. I need to move you, he said. Tonight. They'll have the front and the mews covered within the hour. There's a 3rd exit. The old coal tunnel that runs under the east wall connects to a tradesman's access point on the adjacent street. I'll take you through it. To where? Somewhere they aren't. He moved to the wardrobe and removed a coat. Plain, dark, nondescript. The kind of coat that didn't suggest a duke's household. Do you trust anyone in your current staff? My lady's maid, Evelyn said. Margaret. She's been with me since I was 16. Send word to her through Lucian. She shouldn't go back to Ravenshire House tonight. He held the coat out. Take this. The cloak stays here. She looked at the cloak for a moment, then removed it with the efficiency of someone setting down a weight. The dress beneath it was dark wool, travel appropriate. She'd dressed for running before she'd come here, which meant she'd known things were bad before Anvers died on her doorstep. She'd been preparing for something even before the worst of it happened. He filed that detail somewhere between useful and concerning. She reached for the coat and their hands were briefly in the same proximity, and neither of them acknowledged it. Kadrick, she said. Don't, he said. She stopped. Not tonight, he said. Whatever you're about to say. Not tonight. He turned back to the desk and began writing a rapid note for Lucian. There is a specific order in which things need to happen in the next 2 days, and personal accounting is not in the first several positions. If we survive the ball, you can tell me whatever you need to tell me. I'll listen. I may even respond. But right now you are a material witness to a conspiracy against the crown, and I am the only person in London who has both the motivation and the resources to do anything about it, so we are going to stay focused on that. She was quiet for a long moment. He felt her looking at the back of his head with the specific quality of attention that someone gives a thing they're trying to decide whether to push against or leave alone. She left it alone, which told him something. He sealed the note. The coal tunnel was exactly as unpleasant as its function suggested. Kedrick went first with a lamp held low, moving through the narrow passage with the practiced efficiency of someone who had mapped this route years ago against a contingency he'd hoped not to need. Evelyn followed without complaint about the conditions, which confirmed the impression he'd been forming since she'd climbed onto his balcony, that the intervening 3 years had not made her softer. If anything, they'd made her more capable of endurance, which was not the same as harder and was in certain ways more interesting. He did not think about what was interesting about her. They emerged on Crispin Lane through a coal merchant's cellar door, into a back street that smelled of horse and wet stone, and the particular London winter smell of 1,000 chimneys working simultaneously. The snow was still coming down hard enough to reduce visibility in ways that were equally useful to them, and to anyone looking for them. He had a location 2 streets over, a set of rooms above a cartographer's shop that he maintained under a different name for exactly this category of purpose. The cartographer asked no questions. The rooms were cold but structurally sound and equipped with the basics. More importantly, they were unknown to anyone in Hardcastle's network, which at this point meant unknown to almost anyone. He let them in through the back. The rooms were dark and cold and smelled of old paper and something like linseed oil from the shop below. He lit the single lamp and built a small fire in the grate, without ceremony. Evelyn sat in the room's one decent chair and looked around at the bare, functional space with an expression he couldn't immediately read. "This is not how I imagined your safe house," she said. "It's not meant to be imagined," he said. "It's meant to be overlooked." She made a small sound that might have been acknowledgement. She was exhausted. He could see the shape of it in her posture, the way she was holding herself upright through will rather than energy, the slight lag in her responses that came from a body that had been running on emergency reserves for hours. She had watched a man die in front of her, fled through the London streets in a snowstorm, climbed onto a second-floor balcony, and been debriefed by a man who had every complicated personal reason not to help her. She had not broken down. She had not asked to. He was not sure what to do with that. He set water to boil over the fire and said nothing. She said nothing. The silence in the room was not comfortable exactly, but it was functional, which for the moment was enough. "You said you might know who RV is," she said eventually. "Roland Voss, Deputy Attaché to the Sovereign Household Administrator, former military, 4th Regiment, Peninsula Campaign, honorable discharge in 1815. He sat on the edge of the table. "He's been moving in Hardcastle's social orbit for 2 years. I noticed it because Hardcastle's social orbit intersects with 3 of my primary shipping contacts, and I monitor those intersections. You monitor Hardcastle. I monitor anyone who is in a position to benefit from the Blackthorn ruin," he said. "Hardcastle has been on that list for 4 years. I couldn't prove anything. I was waiting." She looked at him carefully. "You were waiting for this." "I was waiting for something," he said. "The specific shape of it is worse than I'd projected." The water boiled. He made tea with the efficiency of someone performing a task rather than an hospitality ritual, and handed her a cup without asking whether she wanted it. She took it with both hands and held it for the warmth. "He'll know it was me," she said. "Hardcastle. He'll know I'm the connection between Anvers and wherever the investigation leads. Once he realizes I came here." "He doesn't know you came here," Kedrick said. "He knows you left Ravenshire House. The men in the street were tracking your general direction. They didn't follow you through the tunnel because they didn't know about the tunnel." He sat down across from her. "You have a window, small. We need to use it before it closes." "Use it how?" "The ball," he said. "Hardcastle will be there. Voss almost certainly controls the security rotation for that evening. Whatever they're planning is embedded in the event structure, the access points, the timing, the personnel. If we can identify the mechanism, we can intercept it. But I need one thing I don't currently have." "What?" "Someone Hardcastle trusts enough to want near him that evening." He held her gaze. A recently widowed countess with impeccable lineage and no obvious connection to a trading duke she once chose not to marry. Someone he'd welcome as a social ally. Someone who can be in the rooms I can't be in. The fire popped and settled. Evelyn looked at him across the small table with the tea warming her hands and her dead husband's family name and 3 years of her own complicated accounting in her eyes. "You want me to go to the ball," she said. "I want you to work the ball," he said. "There's a difference. I just watched a man die on my doorstep. I know. They will try to kill me if they identify me as a threat." "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. He did not soften it. He did not add reassurances he couldn't guarantee or qualify the risk in ways that would make it feel smaller than it was. She was not a woman who responded well to managed truth. He had understood that about her years before he understood most other things about her. And the situation was specifically the kind that punished comfortable fictions. "And if I say no," she said. "Then I find another way," he said. "And you stay here until it's resolved or it isn't." He paused. "But you're the only person who read that letter. You're the only one who can identify the specific language, the dates, the operational details that would let me map the plan. Without you, I'm working with fragments. With you, I have a chance of stopping this before the king is in a room with a man who has been positioned to kill him for 9 months." She set the cup down on the table very carefully. "You haven't asked me," she said quietly, "why I came to you. Of all the people in London I could have gone to." He was quiet for a moment. "I assumed it was tactical," he said. "I have resources. I have motivation. I'm outside the social and political networks Hardcastle operates in, which makes me harder to compromise through those networks." "That's part of it," she said. He said nothing. "Cadric, I heard you the first time," he said. "I said, not tonight." She stopped again. Her jaw tightened slightly. He recognized it. The specific quality of restraint she deployed when she was deciding whether something was worth the cost of saying it. 3 years ago, she'd deployed it often, in his presence. Usually because what she wanted to say was something she'd already decided she couldn't afford. The fire worked steadily in the grate. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and somewhere across the city 3 riders were reporting to someone that they'd lost the trail, which bought them time measured in hours rather than days. "All right," she said finally. "I'll go to the ball." Cadric nodded once. "There are conditions," she said. "There always are." Her eyes sharpened. "Don't do that." He met her gaze and held it, and something passed between them that neither of them named and that neither of them looked away from. It lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then he stood and moved to the window and looked at the snow-covered street below. "State your conditions," he said. "We do this together," she said. "Not me as an instrument you're deploying. Together. Every decision we make in the next 2 days, we make it in the same room with both of us in it. I don't get managed or rerouted or handed information selectively because you've decided I can't handle something." "Agreed." "And after," she said, "if there is an after, you listen." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city moved through its midnight operations, indifferent to small rooms where 2 people with a great deal of complicated history were negotiating the terms of a collaboration that neither of them had chosen and both of them required. "If there is an after," he said, "I'll listen." She accepted this. He could hear it in the quality of the silence she offered back. He turned away from the window to find her watching him with an expression he'd seen once before. In the garden of her father's estate 3 years ago, about 40 seconds before she told him that marrying him was a structural risk she couldn't take. He had not understood that expression then. He understood it now well enough to know he still didn't have a clean category for it. He was about to say something entirely practical about tomorrow's logistics when a sound came from the street below that rearranged everything. Not riders this time. Footsteps. Multiple sets, moving with the coordinated cadence of a military formation rather than street traffic. He crossed to the lamp and extinguished it in one motion, dropping the room into firelight only. "Get away from the window," he said. She was already moving. He pressed himself to the wall beside the window frame and looked down at a 30-degree angle through the gap at the edge of the shutter. 4 men. Dark coats, no livery he could immediately identify, moving in a 2-and-2 pattern that was specific enough to tell him they'd been trained together. One of them stopped directly below the cartographer's window and looked up. It wasn't a coincidental glance. It was an assessment. Cadric pulled back from the window with complete stillness. They had found the safe house. The only people who knew this address were Lucien and himself. which meant one of two things. Either Lucien had been compromised, taken, pressured, turned, or the address had been extracted from him by force, the bruises from earlier, the careful way he'd held his shoulder. Lucien hadn't walked into a fight tonight. He'd been worked on methodically and then released, and he'd come to Blackthorn House while being followed, and Kaedric, who prided himself on anticipating exactly this kind of operation, had missed it entirely. He looked across the dark room at Evelyn. She was standing very still with her back against the far wall, watching him with the contained focus of someone who has decided panic is not available as an option. "Is there another way out?" she said. "There's a roof access," he said, "but it puts us on the street within 2 minutes, and they'll have the perimeter covered." "So we stay." "We stay," he said, "and we let them come up." She looked at him. "I have 2 pistols and a knife," he said. "I'd rather not use any of them. But 4 men, a single staircase, and a room with 2 defensible positions changes the arithmetic considerably." He was already moving, pulling the table to a specific angle, positioning the chair. "The question is whether they want us alive or whether this is a termination." "If they wanted us dead," Evelyn said steadily, "they'd have set the building on fire." He looked at her. She was right. It was the correct tactical read. "They want what you know," he said, "which means they want you breathing long enough to extract it." "And you?" "They'll make a determination about me on arrival," he said, "which means I have approximately 30 seconds to make a more compelling determination about them first." The footsteps hit the first stair. Kaedric positioned himself where the door's swing would initially block him, pistol in hand, every calculation he'd made in the last 4 years about loyalty and betrayal, and the specific cost of caring about specific people, compressing itself into the quiet and total focus of a man who has nothing left to protect except the things that matter, and has decided, with complete clarity, exactly what those things are. The door opened. The door opened and Kaedric moved before it was fully through its arc. He came from behind the swing with his left arm already extended, catching the first man at the throat with enough force to collapse him backward into the second before either of them had completed a full step into the room. The pistol came up in his right hand, aimed at the third man, who froze in the doorway with the specific stillness of someone making rapid calculations about whether the man pointing a weapon at him was the kind who would use it. Kaedric was exactly that kind. "Hands," he said. All 4 men stopped. The first was on the floor, working through the experience of having his larynx compressed. The second had stumbled back against the doorframe. The third and fourth were in the narrow corridor beyond, visible enough to account for, close enough to be a problem the moment his attention moved. And then the 4th man stepped into the lamplight from the corridor. Kaedric looked at him for 1 full second. Lucien Graves. Not captured, not coerced. Standing upright with his arms loose at his sides and his face arranged into something that wasn't quite an apology and wasn't quite justification and was therefore, Kaedric recognized, the expression of a man who had made a decision he intended to stand behind. The room's temperature didn't change. The fire kept working. The snow kept falling outside. Everything continued operating on its prior terms while Kaedric's internal architecture sustained a structural impact that he would not, in this moment, allow to reach his face. He had been wrong about the bruises. He had been wrong about the shoulder. He had been wrong about Lucien in a way that was going to require him to revise not just a tactical assessment, but 8 years of accumulated trust, and the revision was already happening somewhere below his sternum, in a place that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the specific damage that only proximity can produce. "Lower the pistol," Lucien said. "Nobody in this room is here to kill you." "Then what is this room?" Kaedric said. "A conversation you wouldn't have agreed to otherwise." "You brought 4 men to a conversation." "I brought 4 men to a conversation with you," Lucien said. "There's a difference." Kaedric held the aim for 2 more seconds. Then he lowered the pistol slowly, not because he trusted the room, but because Lucien was right about the arithmetic, and the pistol was theater at this point. He stepped back, putting the wall behind him again, and looked at Lucien with the particular quality of attention he reserved for things he was trying to understand before deciding how to destroy them. The man on the floor had recovered enough to sit up. The other 3 positioned themselves without instruction in a loose arrangement that was defensive rather than aggressive. They were not trying to block exits. They were trying to ensure they had clear lines to each other. Professional habit. These were not Hardcastle's street muscle. These were something else. "Who are they?" Kaedric said. "Sovereign Intelligence," Lucien said. "The branch." Evelyn, still against the far wall, made a sound that was not quite a word but contained one. Kaedric kept his eyes on Lucien. "How long?" It was not a question. The flatness of it was its own punctuation. Lucien's jaw tightened. 4 months. 4 months. Kadrick repeated it the way you repeat something that requires verification before it can be processed. 4 months you've been reporting to the Crown's intelligence apparatus while running my operation. I was recruited because of your operation, Lucien said. Not against it. They needed someone with access to the dock networks. I provided it. What did you provide them? Movement records, cargo manifests, names of men in the docking guilds who'd been bribed to alter inspection records. Lucien paused. All of it pointed the same direction you'd been looking for 4 years. Hardcastle. And you decided to assist that investigation without telling me. I decided to assist it in the way that didn't get you killed, Lucien said sharply, because if Hardcastle knew you were actively building a case against him, he wouldn't have waited for the ball. He'd have moved on you 6 weeks ago. The fire in the grate popped. Kadrick did not blink. He understood the argument. He could follow its internal logic to its conclusion and find it technically coherent. A man who had spent 8 years learning how Kadrick Vale operated, learning what his plans looked like before he announced them, learning which information he would act on immediately and which he would hold. That man would understand exactly when to protect Kadrick by withholding something rather than disclosing it. That understanding did not change what the withholding felt like. It sat in his chest like a weight that had no precise name in the vocabulary available to him, which was itself a kind of information about the extent of the damage. You found the address, Kadrick said. Yes. Because you knew the address. Yes? Which means everything I've kept here, every contingency I've run through this location, is known to the branch? Lucien said. Yes, I'm not going to lie to you about the scope of it. Kadrick looked at him for a long moment. Why are you here tonight, specifically? Because the timeline accelerated. One of the branch men, the one who'd been in the doorway, stepped forward slightly. He was perhaps 50, compact, with the economy of movement that distinguished men who had spent decades making themselves difficult to notice. He had a small scar below his left ear that Kadrick catalogued automatically. My name is Wren. I work directly beneath the Crown Council. Lord Hardcastle moves against the king tomorrow night, not the night of the ball. The room went very still. The ball is cover, Wren continued. The actual operation is a private dinner the king is attending tomorrow at Whitmore House. 12 guests, closed staff. We discovered the change in schedule 40 hours ago. Hardcastle discovered we discovered it approximately 4 hours after that. He paused. Which means tomorrow night's dinner is now both the real target and a potential trap. For whom? Evelyn said from across the room. Every head turned toward her. Wren looked at her with the careful assessment of someone encountering a variable he hadn't fully accounted for. Lady Morrow, he said. Answer the question. Wren considered her for a moment. Then he looked back at Kadrick. For anyone who acts on what they know. Hardcastle is aware that Anvers spoke to someone before he died. He doesn't know what was conveyed or to whom. If someone moves against the dinner operation, he identifies the source of the breach and eliminates it. If no one moves, the king dies at a private dinner that looks like a medical episode, and Hardcastle's faction takes control of the succession negotiation. So your plan, Kadrick said, is to use what Evelyn knows to get close enough to identify Voss's access point, and then we move on Hardcastle directly, Wren said, before he can move on the dinner. With what evidence? Wren reached into his coat and produced a document. He set it on the table without drama and stepped back. Kadrick crossed to the table and looked at it. Treasury disbursement records. Real ones. Alongside them, a copy of the cargo authorization signed by Voss. And at the bottom of the stack, a letter. Not Anvers' letter, which was gone, but a different letter, older, written in Hardcastle's distinctive hand from 3 years ago, discussing the financial architecture of a shipping network that bore a very specific resemblance to the Blackthorn Estate's commercial structure in its final 2 years. Kadrick went still. Where did you get this? He said. We've been building this file for 14 months, Wren said. We needed the final layer, the operational connection between the financial crimes and the current plot. What Anvers carried was that layer. He paused. We need Lady Morrow to reconstruct the letter's contents from memory. Everything she read, with sufficient specificity to serve as corroborating testimony for what we already hold. Kadrick set the documents down carefully. He looked at Lucien. Lucien met his gaze without flinching, which was either courage or the specific self-possession of a man who had decided the act was defensible and intended to inhabit that decision regardless of the cost. Kadrick had seen both in the same face before and could not always tell the difference in real time. "Step outside," Kedrick said. Lucien's brow tightened slightly. "The four of you," Kedrick said. "Give me 5 minutes with her. Then we'll discuss terms." Wren looked at him with the neutral assessment of a man calculating whether this was a negotiating position or a genuine request. 3 minutes, Wren said. They filed out. Lucien was last. He paused at the door and looked back at Kadrick with something in his face that was either regret or the closest approximation Lucien Graves could produce, and Kadrick looked back at him with nothing at all, because the nothing was the most precise thing available. The door closed. Kedrick stood in the firelit room and breathed once, slowly, and allowed himself approximately 4 seconds of something he would not call feeling, but that operated like it in the relevant anatomical regions. And then he put it away with the efficient finality of a man returning a tool to a drawer because the current task requires different tools. He turned to Evelyn. She was watching him with the expression he was beginning to recognize as her specific response to watching him do exactly that. The compression, the compartmentalization, the way he moved devastation from the foreground to somewhere it couldn't interfere with function. She looked at it the way people look at something they find simultaneously impressive and terrible. "You're not going to let yourself react to that," she said. "I'm reacting to it," he said. "I'm just doing it quietly." She was quiet for a moment. "Kadrick, Lucien didn't betray you. Not in the way he made decisions about what I needed to know," Kadrick said, "on my behalf. Without my knowledge. The reason he did it doesn't change what it was." He moved to the window and looked at the snow. "Every person I have trusted in my life who has decided to protect me by managing my information has done damage that they didn't calculate into their protection." She absorbed that without responding to the parts of it that applied to her, which told him she heard them clearly. "The letter," he said. "Can you reconstruct it accurately enough to be useful?" "Yes," she said. "I read it twice. I have a specific memory. Everything. Dates, figures, the exact phrasing of the access instructions." "Yes." He turned from the window. "Then here's the problem with Wren's plan. He wants us to provide testimony that completes his file. Once we do that, we become the kind of loose end that sophisticated operations manage by ensuring the witnesses are unavailable at trial. Hardcastle has enough institutional reach to make that happen with plausible deniability. Wren may be genuinely working against Hardcastle, or he may be working a parallel angle we can't see. I don't know him. I have no read on him. I have no leverage over him." Evelyn looked at him. "So what do you want to do?" "I want to attend that dinner tomorrow," Kedrick said. "Not as an operative working under Wren's direction. As myself. As the Duke of Blackthorn, who has been on the invitation list for the Whitmore House dinner for 6 weeks and accepted it as a social obligation." He paused. "Inside that room, with the actual players present and the operation in motion, I have variables I can work. Hardcastle knows I've been rebuilding. He doesn't know what I know. That asymmetry is the only real advantage we have, and Wren's plan burns it." "You're talking about walking into the room where they plan to kill the king," Evelyn said, "and improvising." "I'm talking about walking into that room with more preparation than Hardcastle expects and fewer constraints than Wren wants to impose," Kadrick said. "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "And me." "You go with me," he said, "not because I need you in the room, because I'm not leaving you outside it where Hardcastle's people can reach you." Something shifted in her expression. It was very small. He decided not to examine it. "All right," she said. "Tell Wren." He opened the door. The 4 men and Lucien filed back in and arranged themselves in the same positions as before. Wren looked at Kadrick with the patient attention of a man who had negotiated with difficult people before and found it professionally interesting. "We'll reconstruct the letter," Kadrick said. "Every word she remembers, certified in writing tonight. You'll have it before dawn." He held Wren's gaze. "In exchange, we attend the Whitmore dinner under our own direction. No handlers, no instructions from the branch. We move independently, and you follow our lead." "That's not how this works," Wren said. "It is tonight," Kedrick said. "Because I am the only person in this room Hardcastle hasn't accounted for in his operational planning. And if you put your people around me, I stop being unpredictable and start being a liability." He paused. "You've been building this file for 14 months. You're one dinner away from either ending Hardcastle or losing the king. You need me functional and autonomous inside that room. That's the exchange." Wren was quiet for a long moment. He looked at Kaedric with the calculating patience of someone doing real arithmetic. Agreed, he said, with one condition. Name it. Lucien stays with you, Ren said. Not as your man, as mine. Kaedric looked at Lucien for the second time since the door had opened. Lucien looked back at him with the careful stillness of someone waiting to learn what category they now occupied in a taxonomy that had just been substantially revised. Fine, Kaedric said. He said it the way you agree to terms you intend to renegotiate later, in a context where later is controlled by whoever survives. Evelyn sat at the table and began reconstructing the letter from memory, her voice steady and precise, while Ren's man recorded it in a careful hand. Kaedric stood by the window and listened and looked at the snow, and thought about every calculation he'd made in the last 8 years, about which people were load-bearing walls in his architecture and which were decorative and what the difference felt like when the structure began moving. Lucien stood across the room and didn't speak. The silence between them had a specific texture now, not the functional silence of two men who shared moral syntax. Something with more edge to it. The silence of a relationship that had not yet determined what it was going to be. Kaedric had built his entire operational life on the principle that loyalty was the one commodity that couldn't be manufactured on demand, that it either existed in its genuine form or it didn't exist at all, and that the genuine form was identifiable by the fact that it cost the person extending it something real. Lucien had paid a cost. He had carried the weight of the deception for 4 months and worn the bruises of its cover story and brought it to a head in the one moment when concealment was no longer viable. By Kaedric's own framework, that was loyalty, not comfortable loyalty, not the kind that kept accounts clean and consciences clear, the jagged kind, the kind that looked like betrayal from the outside until you mapped the full geometry of it. He was not ready to map the full geometry of it. He was also not ready to discard 8 years. He kept his face at the window. Dawn was still 3 hours away. The Whitmore House dinner was in less than 20 hours. Hardcastle would spend those hours believing he had controlled the variables, that the breach was contained, the witness either dead or running, the timeline intact. He would walk into that dinner room with the confidence of a man who had been orchestrating hidden destruction for 30 years without consequence, who had learned that the most powerful position is the one no one knows you occupy. He had never been in a room with Kaedric Vale, while Kaedric Vale knew what he'd done. That was the only advantage that mattered, and it was about to be the last one. Because when Evelyn finished the final page of her reconstruction and set down the pen, the branch operative took the document and read the final paragraph she'd transcribed, the one with the operational details she'd buried in her memory for hours, the one that changed the shape of everything, and went very still. He looked at Ren. Ren read it. Then Ren looked at Kaedric with an expression that was, for the first time all evening, something other than controlled. "There's a second target," Ren said. Kaedric looked at him. "The letter names 2 objectives for the dinner," Ren said slowly. "The king, and you." The fire had burned down to embers. The room was cold and very quiet, and Kaedric stood in it processing the specific information that the man who had destroyed his family's legacy 20 years ago had also, at some point in the last 14 months, decided that the reconstruction of that legacy required a permanent solution. He had walked into this thinking he was the weapon. He had just learned he was also the target. The silence after Ren spoke lasted 4 seconds. Kaedric counted them the way he counted everything in high-pressure environments. Not from anxiety, but from the understanding that time had texture in moments like this, that 4 seconds of genuine stillness contained information about every person in the room. Lucien went rigid, Evelyn's hand still resting on the reconstructed letter, pressed flat against the paper. The branch operative who'd been recording stopped writing mid-stroke. Ren watched Kaedric with the careful attention of a man waiting to see what a very dangerous thing does when it learns it's been cornered. Kaedric said nothing. He crossed to the table and read the final paragraph himself. Evelyn's handwriting was precise, unhurried, the product of a woman who had been taught that legibility was a form of discipline. The words were clear. The second objective was described in the same financial euphemism as the first, a liability to be resolved concurrent with the primary disbursement, but the identifier attached to it was specific enough to be unmistakable. The Blackthorn account, settled in full. He set the paper down. "How long have you known about the second target?" he said to Ren. "We didn't," Ren said, "until 30 seconds ago." Kaedric looked at him. "The file we built covered the financial crimes and the primary plot," Ren said. "We had no intelligence suggesting Hardcastle intended a second action at the dinner. This changes our operational calculus significantly. It changes mine more, Kedrick said. He moved away from the table and stood with his back to the room for a moment, which was not a performance of distress, but a practical measure. He needed 4 seconds, without anyone reading his face, while he reorganized everything he'd been planning around a variable that hadn't existed 60 seconds ago. His own death as a scheduled event, penciled into the same operational timeline as a king's assassination, arranged by the man who had already arranged the destruction of his family's finances, his father's final years, and the estate that 3 generations had built. Hardcastle hadn't been content with ruin. He'd been waiting for the reconstruction to reach sufficient value before eliminating the architect. There was something almost clarifying about that. The ruin had been incomplete, too visible, too dependent on the assumption that a 23-year-old with no resources and no allies would simply stay ruined. Kedrick hadn't stayed ruined. He'd come back with 4 years of compounded interest on the original destruction, and Hardcastle had apparently decided that the cleaner solution was a permanent one. In another life, that might have made Kedrick angry. In this one, it made him focused. He turned back to the room. The plan doesn't change. We attend the dinner. The plan absolutely changes, Wren said sharply. You are now a confirmed target of an active assassination operation. Protocol requires you to protect the king, Kedrick said. I'm not the king. I'm a private citizen who has just learned that someone intends to kill him, which is a category of information I'm fully capable of acting on without your protocol's assistance. He looked at Wren with the flat directness that he'd long since stopped softening for rooms where softness cost him credibility. You need me in that dinner. The second target designation doesn't change that. If anything, it improves my position inside the room, because Hardcastle will expect me to be unaware of it. A man who doesn't know he's marked behaves differently from a man who does, and I can perform the former while operating as the latter. Wren studied him for a long moment. You're using yourself as bait. I'm using myself as the variable Hardcastle failed to account for, Kedrick said. There's a distinction. Evelyn stood up from the table. She did it quietly, but the quality of movement had weight to it. The kind of movement that precedes speech that has been decided on rather than improvised. I'm going, she said. Every head turned. To the dinner, she said. With him. That was the arrangement. Lady Morrow, Wren began. The situation has materially confirmed that the 2 people in this room who have the most direct knowledge of Hardcastle's operation are both on his list, she said, which means separating us doesn't make either of us safer. It makes both of us more isolated. She looked at Kedrick. I'm going. He looked at her for a moment. The firelight made her face difficult to read in its usual ways, flattening some things and sharpening others. What he could read was the decision, clean, final, arrived at through whatever private calculus she'd been running since Wren said the second target's name. Yes, he said. They left the cartographer's rooms before first light, with Lucien 2 paces behind and Wren's operatives distributed somewhere in the streets beyond visible range, which Kedrick found marginally preferable to having them adjacent. He spent the hours before the dinner in controlled preparation, acquiring what he needed through channels that didn't connect to his primary identity, communicating through intermediaries whose loyalty was a matter of financial architecture rather than personal trust, thinking through every possible configuration of the dinner's geography against what Wren's operational files had told him about Whitmore House. He slept for 90 minutes in the afternoon, not from any relaxed state, but from the disciplined understanding that a body running on no rest makes errors that strategy can't compensate for. He woke to the sound of the city outside and the specific interior quiet of a man who has reduced his world to the next several hours and found the reduction almost restful. Evelyn was in the adjacent room. He knew because he could hear the particular quality of occupied silence through the wall. The small sounds of a person moving carefully in a space they're not trying to disturb. He did not go to the door. She did not come to his. They had said what needed saying. Everything else was still in the queue. Whitmore House occupied the northeast corner of a residential square that smelled of old money and stone, the kind of address that communicated permanence through architecture rather than ostentation. 12 guests for a private dinner with the king. Kedrick arrived in a carriage that belonged to someone else, wearing clothes that had been prepared for exactly this event 6 weeks ago, before any of the current complications existed, carrying nothing that would cause comment, and one thing that would not be found in a standard search, because it was not in a standard location. He handed his coat to a footman in the entrance hall and scanned the room in a single sweep. Hardcastle was near the fireplace talking to a man Kaedric didn't recognize. He was 64 years old, lean, impeccably turned out, with the social ease of someone who had spent decades converting institutional access into personal power and found the work congenial. He looked up when Kaedric entered, and something moved through his expression. Not alarm, not guilt. The specific microadjustment of a man recalibrating the timeline of an event he'd already planned in detail. He recovered in under a second, raised his glass fractionally in greeting, smiled with the warmth of a man performing warmth for an audience that included the person it was directed at. Kaedric smiled back with exactly the same quality of warmth. Two men performing for each other in a room full of people who didn't know there was a performance happening. That was the specific arena Kaedric had spent 4 years learning to inhabit, and he was considerably better at it than Hardcastle knew. Evelyn arrived 12 minutes later, which was the planned interval, close enough to the same event to be natural, distant enough not to signal coordination. She came in on the arm of a minor lord whose invitation she'd used as social cover, and she moved through the entrance hall with the composed ease of a widow who had learned that the world expected her grief to be proportional to her husband's public importance and had calibrated her presentation accordingly. She did not look at Kaedric when she entered. He did not look at her. Hardcastle looked at both of them. The dinner was 12 courses and lasted 3 hours. And in those 3 hours, Kaedric conducted the most sustained performance of social normalcy he had ever executed while simultaneously tracking 5 distinct variables: Hardcastle's position, the footman rotation through the service corridor, the location of the man he'd identified as Voss from Wren's physical description, the king's movements between courses, and the specific quality of tension in the room that was building so gradually that no one at the table would have been able to identify its source. Kaedric could identify it. It was the tension of an operation that had been timed to the dinner's structure, and that structure was now in its final third. He was on Hardcastle's left. Evelyn was 4 seats down, angled across the table, close enough to the king to be socially appropriate and distant enough not to suggest positioning. They had planned the seating arrangement through the host's social secretary 3 days ago with the specific logic of people who understood that geography is argument in rooms like this. The king was speaking to his neighbor about something Kaedric was not tracking closely enough to repeat. He was a man of 61, with the careful energy of someone who had been managing his own health against public expectation for years, pleasant in the way that people trained from childhood in the art of pleasant become not warm exactly, but frictionless. He was also, in approximately 20 minutes if Kaedric's reading of the timeline was accurate, going to be in direct proximity to whatever Voss had positioned in this room. Kaedric set down his fork. "My lord," he said quietly to Hardcastle, "I wanted to discuss the Marseille routine discrepancy with you at some point this evening. Nothing urgent. Whenever you have a moment." Hardcastle looked at him with the smooth social attention of a man who has just heard something unexpected delivered in a tone that suggests it isn't unexpected at all. "Of course," Hardcastle said. "After dinner, perhaps?" "Of course," Kaedric said. He picked up his fork again. After dinner was when Hardcastle planned to be elsewhere. Kaedric knew this because the operational structure required Hardcastle to have an alibi at the moment of action, to be visible and accountable in a different room when the primary event occurred. The mention of a post-dinner conversation was a flag. It told Hardcastle that Kaedric intended to be proximate to him, specifically when the timeline was moving. It introduced a variable into the alibi architecture. He watched Hardcastle process this for 3 seconds before the man's expression resettled. Good. He was recalculating. Let him recalculate. Between the 10th and 11th courses, Kaedric stood and moved toward the service corridor door with the unhurried ease of a man seeking a moment away from a long table. 2 footmen were in the corridor. Neither was Voss. He moved further in, past the serving station, to the secondary corridor that ran along the back of the house. Voss was there. He was standing near a drinks cabinet with a small glass vial in his hand and the specific alertness of a man interrupted during a careful task. He was perhaps 35, slim, with the residual military posture of someone who'd kept the habit after leaving the service. He looked at Kaedric with the fraction of a second's pure shock that always preceded professional recalibration. Kaedric spoke before he could complete the recalibration. "Put it down," he said. Voss looked at him. "I know what it is," Kaedric said. "I know the timeline. I know Hardcastle's secondary objective for tonight. And I know that whatever he's paying you, there are now approximately 8 branch operatives positioned within 30 seconds of this corridor who will reach you before you reach the dining room." He paused. So put it down. Voss was very still. His eyes ran the calculation that men in his position always ran. The variables, the exits, the probability distribution of outcomes. Kedrick had seen that calculation before in men who ran it correctly and men who ran it wrong. He said you'd come tonight, Voss said. His voice was flat, military, stripped of ornament. He said if you appeared, it meant the operation was compromised. He was right. He said if the operation was compromised, I should complete the primary objective regardless. Voss's hand tightened on the vial. The secondary was optional, the primary wasn't. Kedrick moved. Not for the vial. That was what Voss expected, and Voss had a knife that would come out the moment Kedrick reached for the obvious target. He moved for Voss's right arm at the elbow, catching the joint and rotating it backward with enough force to make the hand open reflexively, and the vial dropped, and he caught it with his left hand before it hit the floor, while Voss's free hand went for the knife exactly as projected, and Kedrick put his forearm across Voss's throat and the wall behind him simultaneously and held him there. The knife was halfway out. Don't, Kedrick said. Voss looked at him from 3 inches away with the specific expression of a man in genuine physical extremity making a genuine decision. His pulse was visible at his temple. His breathing was short and controlled. He'll kill my family, Voss said. It came out rough. Not a manipulation. A statement of fact from a man who had run out of the space in which facts could be managed. Kedrick held his position and his gaze. He knew what it cost to say that. He knew the specific weight of that sentence. The admission that the choice being made wasn't ideological or mercenary, but coerced. The admission that someone had gotten close enough to everything that mattered to use it as operating leverage. He knew that weight with a precision that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the particular education his own life had provided. Where? Kedrick said. What? Where are they being held? Voss stared at him. Why? Because that is the piece of this that is still fixable, Kedrick said. Tell me where, and I'll have branch operatives there before this dinner is over. Your family walks. You surrender the vial, and you give testimony against Hardcastle, and you face what comes after that, but your family walks. He held the man's gaze. That is the only version of tonight where they're safe, regardless of what you do in the next 60 seconds. The knife hand was still partially extended. Voss's breathing had changed. Still short, but with a different quality. The calculation was happening again, but differently now. East Wapping, Voss said. A warehouse on Crane Street. 4 men. Kedrick reached into his coat with the hand that wasn't holding Voss and removed the small device Wren had given him, a signal mechanism, crude and effective, and activated it once. Then he stepped back and let Voss's arm go. Voss stood against the wall, breathing hard with the knife still in his hand, and the decision still technically available to him, and the whole architecture of coercion he'd been operating inside for 9 months, suddenly containing a door it hadn't contained before. He put the knife away. Kedrick closed his hand around the vial. He walked back down the corridor toward the dining room with the vial in his fist and the specific interior state of a man who has just spent everything available to spend and is operating now on the other side of expenditure. Not empty, but reduced to the irreducible, which was in certain ways more efficient than the full inventory. He pushed open the dining room door. The table was as he'd left it. 11 guests, 1 king, candles burning at both ends, the social machinery of a formal dinner proceeding in its customary channels. Hardcastle was in his seat. He looked up when the door opened. His eyes went immediately to Kedrick's hand, then to Kedrick's face, and he held the look for precisely the length of time it took him to understand what the look on Kedrick's face meant. And then something moved in Hardcastle's expression that Kedrick had never seen there before. Fear. Real fear. The kind that comes not from physical threat, but from the recognition that the architecture you've built over 30 years has just encountered the one variable you didn't adequately account for. And that variable is currently standing in the doorway of your most carefully planned room, holding the instrument of your primary objective in his closed fist. Kedrick walked back to his chair and sat down and set his glass up for the next wine service with the unhurried ease of a man with nowhere to be. Hardcastle had not moved. The man to Kedrick's left said something about the quality of the claret. Kedrick agreed that it was exceptional. He could feel Hardcastle's gaze on the side of his face like a physical pressure. He could feel the operation unraveling in real time. Voss contained, the vial neutralized, Wren's people moving on East Wapping, the timeline collapsing inward on a plan that had required all its pieces to move in sequence and had just lost the primary mechanism. He could also feel, without looking, that Hardcastle had made a decision. The chair scraped. Hardcastle stood, said something brief to the host about a moment's indisposition, and moved toward the far door. Not the service corridor, the main hall door, toward the coat room and the street. Kadrick stood at the same moment. "Excuse me," he said to no one in particular. Evelyn looked up from 4 seats down. Their eyes met for the first time all evening. He saw in her face the complete situational read of a woman who had been tracking the room as precisely as he had, and had arrived at the same calculation at the same moment. He moved toward the door Hardcastle had gone through. The main hall was dim, 2 footmen at the far end, coats on their hooks along the right wall. Hardcastle was already at the exterior door, moving with the controlled urgency of a man who had determined that tonight's plan had failed, and that the next priority was distance. He had one hand on the door. "Hardcastle," Kedrick said. The man stopped. His hand was on the door. His back was to the room. 3 seconds passed. Then he turned, and Kedrick saw the pistol in his hand. It was not Hardcastle's hand that was shaking. It was his jaw. The smallest possible tremor, the seismic trace of a man containing something very large in a very small space. He was 64 years old, and he had spent 30 years building a world in which he held every meaningful lever. And he was standing in a coat room with a pistol raised at the man he'd tried to ruin twice, and watching that man look at the pistol with nothing in his face that resembled fear. Because there wasn't any. That was the truth of it, the thing Kedrick Vale had learned in the spaces between survival and whatever came after. Fear required the belief that what you stood to lose was worth protecting at the cost of everything else. He had reorganized his inventory so carefully, so deliberately over so many years, that what remained was a very short list. Short enough that a pistol in a coat room didn't change its value. "You ruined my family," Kedrick said. "You arranged my father's financial collapse. You've spent 14 months planning to finish what you started." He held the man's gaze. "Why?" Hardcastle's jaw tightened. "Your father made a promise he didn't keep." "What promise?" "That's not a conversation for tonight." "It's the only conversation we're going to have," Kedrick said, "so make it tonight." Hardcastle looked at him across the dim hall, with the pistol still raised, and the weight of 30 years of maneuvering and patience and hidden destruction compressed into the specific gravity of a man deciding whether the next several seconds serve any purpose. "Your father owed me a debt," Hardcastle said. "Not money. Something he promised and then gave to someone else. Something I had spent 20 years earning." His voice was very controlled. "When Adrian Vale broke that promise, I decided the appropriate response was to take everything he'd built and give him enough time to watch it go before he died." He paused. "I hadn't anticipated that his son would prove considerably more difficult to keep down." Kedrick was very still. "What did he promise you?" he said. "The Blackthorn seat," Hardcastle said, "on the Privy Council. He swore it to me in writing and then gave it to a man named Ashworth, who offered him better terms." Something moved in the old man's eyes that was almost self-recognition. "I was patient. I am very good at patient." 30 years, Kedrick said. 30 years of patient, for a council seat, for the principal, Hardcastle said, and there was in his voice the terrible clarity of a man who had organized his entire existence around a grievance for so long that the grievance had become indistinguishable from identity. "Your father looked me in the eye and told me my service meant nothing. I decided to demonstrate otherwise." The door at the far end of the hall opened. 3 branch operatives came through it fast and quiet, spread in the pattern Wren had established, weapons drawn. Behind them, Wren himself, moving with the compressed urgency of a man who had received the signal and run the distance. Hardcastle heard them. He looked at Kedrick with the pistol still raised and the specific expression of a man who has just completed the arithmetic of his own situation and found no exit in any direction. His finger tightened on the trigger. Kedrick did not move. There was a single terrible second where everything in the hall was suspended. The branch operatives frozen in their approach, Wren calculating angles, Evelyn appearing in the doorway behind Kedrick with one hand pressed to the frame. And the only sound was the old house settling in the cold and the distant murmur of 11 guests who didn't yet know that the evening had become something other than a dinner. And in that second, Kedrick looked at the man who had destroyed his father and ruined his inheritance and planned his death and tried to use a coerced soldier to kill a king, and he felt something he hadn't expected to feel in this moment. He felt how small it was. Not Hardcastle, the grievance, the 30 years, a council seat. The vast grinding machinery of destruction set in motion by a man who couldn't absorb the specific pain of being passed over, who had decided that the world owed him a form of recognition that no amount of ruin would ever actually provide, who had spent 3 decades becoming powerful in all the ways that didn't address the one wound that actually needed addressing. Kedrick understood that structure. He understood it with a precision that was deeply uncomfortable. He took one step forward. "You will lower that pistol," he said quietly, "and you will surrender to these men, and you will stand in a court and answer for 30 years of it. Every dock worker, every debt, every family you used as leverage." He kept moving, one step at a time, until the barrel was 6 inches from his chest. "Or you fire that pistol in a room full of Crown intelligence officers and accomplish nothing except proving that a 64-year-old man with everything couldn't defeat one person who had nothing." Hardcastle's hand was shaking now. Kedrick did not stop. "Lower it," he said. The hammer was back. The barrel pressed against his sternum, and somewhere in the walls of the old house, in the cold stone silence of an English winter that cared nothing about any of them, something waited to happen that would determine whether everything built from ruin and grief and the refusal to stay finished was going to mean anything at all, or whether it was all going to end 6 inches from the hand of a frightened old man who had never found a way to put down his 30-year wound. Kedrick held his eyes, and he did not look away. The pistol fired. The sound in the enclosed hallway was enormous. Not the clean crack of open-air discharge, but the compressed physical concussion of a weapon going off in stone and plaster, a sound that hit the chest before the ears finished processing it. Kedrick felt the heat of it before he understood that he was still standing, before the arithmetic of the moment resolved into the fact that Hardcastle's hand had moved 2 inches to the right in the final fraction of a second, that the ball had gone into the wall beside him, that the old man had made a choice in the last available moment that was either deliberate or involuntary, and that produced the same result regardless. Hardcastle's arm dropped. The pistol hung from his fingers for a moment and then fell to the floor with the particular sound of metal on stone, and the old man stood in the dim hallway with his hand at his side, and his face doing something that had no precedent in the composed, managed presentation he had maintained for 64 years. It was not grief exactly. Not remorse in any conventional architecture. It was something closer to exhaustion. The specific collapse of a man whose entire structural load has just been removed simultaneously, leaving nothing to hold the shape against. He looked at Kedrick. Kedrick looked back at him and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying in the next 30 seconds that words were the right instrument for. Wren's men moved in from both sides with the practiced efficiency of people who had been waiting for this precise moment and had the presence of mind not to rush it. They took Hardcastle's arms without violence. He offered none. And the branch operative produced restraints while Wren himself crossed to Kedrick and looked at the wall where the ball had entered the plaster. 2 inches, Wren said. 1 3/4, Kedrick said, but the principle holds. Wren looked at him with the expression of a man reassessing something he thought he'd already assessed. "You walked straight into the barrel. I needed him to make the choice while he still had one," Kedrick said. "A man who fires in panic is a different legal matter than a man who surrenders. I wanted the surrender." He looked at Hardcastle, who was now standing between 2 branch operatives with his wrists bound and his face still holding that strange, collapsed quality. "For what I need him to answer for, he needs to be alive and cogent for considerably longer than tonight." Wren nodded slowly. Then he looked past Kedrick. Evelyn was standing in the doorway to the main hall. She had one hand still pressed to the frame and the other at her side, and she was looking at Kedrick with an expression that he recognized as the face a person makes when they have just watched something happen that they had not fully believed would resolve the way it did, and the resolution has required them to revise a structural assumption about the world. He met her eyes. She exhaled. It was a small thing. One breath, released slowly, the kind of breath that carries with it everything a person has been holding compressed while waiting to see how something ends. He watched her do it and felt something move in his chest that he had no clean vocabulary for and did not, in this moment, attempt to translate. The dining room door opened at the end of the hall, and a footman looked through it with the bewildered expression of someone who has heard a loud noise from the direction of a room where loud noises are not on the evening's program. Wren moved toward him with the smooth authority of a man accustomed to managing scenes before they became situations, and the footman retreated and the door closed. Kedrick stood in the hallway with the residual heat of a near miss still registering along his right side, and he looked at his own hand, which was steady, and thought about the fact that steadiness was not the same as the absence of something. It was the management of it. It was the practice of 10,000 mornings choosing function over reaction until function became the reflex and reaction became the thing you processed later, privately, in the hours when no one needed anything from you. He was going to need a great many of those hours. The branch took Hardcastle out through the rear entrance of Whitmore House, while the dinner continued in the main room with 11 guests who would read a version of the evening's events in the papers tomorrow that bore a selective resemblance to what had actually occurred. The king was escorted to a different room by 2 operatives under the guise of a private message from the council, and Kaedric stood in the empty hallway and listened to the house resume its ordinary acoustic texture and felt the specific deflation that follows the end of something that has required everything. Lucien appeared from the direction of the service corridor. He stopped when he saw Kaedric. He had the look of a man who had been waiting for a verdict and has not yet been told what it is. Kaedric looked at him for a long moment. 8 years. The first time he'd seen Lucien Graves, the man had been playing cards in a Portsmouth tavern and cheating so skillfully that Kaedric had watched him for 20 minutes before identifying the method. And then he'd sat down at the table not to expose him, but to ask him to work for a trading operation that needed a man who could maintain multiple accurate accounts simultaneously without anyone noticing the architecture. They had not been friends exactly. What they had been was something that operated with the functional depth of friendship, the specific trust that develops between people who have seen each other in circumstances that strip away performance, who have made decisions together under conditions that produce no good options, who have built something out of shared investment in a result neither of them could have produced alone. East Wapping, Lucien said. Wren's people reached them. Voss's family is out. Kaedric nodded. I know what I did, Lucien said. I'm not going to argue it was something other than what it was. No, Kaedric said. You're not. Lucien held his gaze. I made the call I thought kept you alive. I'd make it again. If that means we're finished, I understand it. Kaedric was quiet for a moment. He looked at the floor, then back up. You kept operational information from me for 4 months, he said, about a conspiracy that named me as a target. You made that judgment call on my behalf without my knowledge or consent. He paused. And you were right that it kept me alive. Both things are true simultaneously, and I haven't yet decided what to do with both of them being true simultaneously. Lucien was quiet. What I know, Kaedric said, is that when I needed you to know something important about who I was and what I was capable of, you knew it. You acted on it without being asked. He looked at him steadily. I'm not finished with you, but I'm not finished with this conversation either. We'll have the rest of it later. Something shifted in Lucien's face. Not relief exactly. Lucien was too familiar with Kaedric's specific accounting to mistake a deferral for a pardon, but something that looked like a man accepting terms he found workable. Later, Lucien agreed. He moved away down the corridor and Kaedric stood alone in the hallway for a moment, and then he went to find Evelyn. She was in the small anteroom off the main entrance, standing by the window with her arms crossed loosely over her chest, looking out at the square below where snow had resumed falling in the thin, persistent way of a city that intended to be cold for several more months, regardless of what happened inside its houses. She heard him come in, but didn't turn immediately. He crossed to where she was standing and stopped a few feet away and looked out the same window. He missed on purpose, she said. Hardcastle. Yes. Why? Kaedric thought about this for a moment. Because he's been making choices for 30 years that he convinced himself were necessary. Necessary enough to justify the mechanics. Tonight, in the last available second, he didn't have the convincing anymore. He paused. A man who fires in that moment commits the act and becomes it permanently. A man who moves his hand has done something terrible and still has the question of what he is. I think he chose to still have the question. She turned to look at him. The window light was pale and cold, and it did the thing that particular quality of light does. Flattened the performance, left the actual face. Are you hurt? She said. No. You walked into the barrel of a loaded pistol. I made a calculated assessment. Kaedric, she said. It was the specific way she said his name when she was done with the version of him that used precision as armor and wanted access to whatever was underneath it. He stopped. He looked at her. I made a calculated assessment, he said again more quietly. That also happened to be the thing I was going to do regardless of the calculation. She held his gaze with the patience of someone who has waited a long time to hear a specific kind of truth and recognizes it when it arrives even in an indirect form. Yes, she said. They stood by the window while the snow fell outside and the house made its settling sounds around them, and Kaedric felt the full weight of the evening moving through him in the way that things move through you once the emergency is over and the body remembers it was a body and not just a mechanism for managing situations. The stitched wound in his ribs had reopened slightly. He could feel the wet warmth of it through his shirt, the familiar minor complaint of a body that had been asked to do too much without being consulted. The pain was specific and manageable, and almost welcome for its simplicity. "There's something I need to say," Evelyn said. "I know. Will you listen, or will you tell me it's not tonight again?" He looked at her. "I'll listen." She turned away from the window and faced him fully. She was not a woman who prepared speeches, she thought in real time, constructed meaning through the act of speaking it, which meant that what came out was often more honest than more rehearsed versions would have been. "I chose Morrow because I was afraid of what wanting you cost," she said. "Not because I didn't want you. Because I did. And that kind of wanting felt like standing at the edge of something with no bottom. And I decided that marrying a safe man was the same as not falling." She paused. "I was wrong about what falling meant. And I was wrong about what safe was. Morrow was a man who couldn't hurt me because he was never close enough to anything real about me to reach it." Kedrick was quiet. "I am not asking you to forgive me for the calculation," she said. "It was a real calculation. My family was in genuine danger, the options were genuinely limited, and you are, someone whose intensity has always required more of me than I was sure I had to give." Her voice was steady, but there was something beneath the steadiness that cost her something. "What I'm asking is whether you still have any architecture left that has room for something true, not managed, not tactical, something that is just what it is." The anteroom was quiet. Somewhere in the house, behind several walls, he could hear the faint sound of the dinner resuming. Silver on porcelain, the murmur of social conversation moving back into its channels, as though the evening had been exactly what it was advertised as. The ordinary machinery of a world that would continue regardless. Kaedric looked at Evelyn Ravenshire and understood something he had been refusing to understand for 3 years with the focused determination of a man who had decided that the understanding would cost more than it was worth. He had been wrong about the cost. He had calculated the risk of caring about her and concluded that the liability outweighed the asset, and he had made that calculation the way his father would have made it, by treating the thing being measured as an abstraction rather than a weight that was already present regardless of whether he acknowledged it. The weight had been there for 8 years. It was there in the way the sentence she'd said in his study had stayed longer than bullets. It was there in every version of calculation he'd run about what the word safe meant, and what it cost, and whether a man who had reconstructed an empire from nothing could afford to be anything other than sufficient to himself. He had been sufficient to himself for 4 years. He was tired of it in a way that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with the specific exhaustion of a structure that has been load-bearing alone for longer than it was designed to sustain. "Yes," he said. She looked at him. "There is architecture," he said. "There has always been architecture. I kept it because getting rid of it was more expensive than maintaining it, which tells you something about the overall financial picture." He paused. "I'm not a man who does this easily. I don't have the equipment for easy. What I have is the capacity for very serious and very difficult, and if that is a workable proposal, then I am making it." Something moved through her face that was not a smile exactly. It was softer and more complicated than that, the specific expression of someone receiving something they had not been certain was available and finding it larger than the version they'd hoped for. "That is a workable proposal," she said. He stepped closer and she didn't step back, and they stood in the cold anteroom window light in the aftermath of an evening that had contained a conspiracy and 2 near deaths and 30 years of someone else's grievance finally brought to account, and Kaedric Vale put his hand against the side of her face with the careful deliberateness of a man handling something he's decided to stop pretending he can afford not to hold. She put her hand over his. They stayed like that for a moment. Not a resolution exactly. Nothing between people with this much complicated history resolves in a single evening, but a beginning that knew it was a beginning, which was already more honest than most things either of them had attempted. The weeks that followed moved in a different register than the weeks before. Hardcastle stood before the Crown's judicial apparatus and answered for 30 years of it, the financial architecture of the Blackthorn ruin laid out in documented sequence, the conspiracy against the king reconstructed from Evelyn's testimony and Voss's corroborating account, and the 14 months of file that Wren's branch had assembled with the patience of people who understood that the strongest cases are the ones that don't rush. Hardcastle offered no dramatic testimony in his own defense. He answered questions in the clipped, controlled manner of a man who had decided that the only dignity left available to him was not begging for a mercy he had not extended to others. Voss testified fully. His family remained intact. He would face consequences proportional to his cooperation, which in the mathematics of the Crown's legal machinery meant something considerably less than Hardcastle's permanent removal from every position of institutional access he had accumulated. The branch classified portions of the case that would have embarrassed the apparatus and published the portions that served the public record. That was how these things worked. Kayadrick understood this without particular complaint. Perfect justice was not a product the world reliably manufactured. What the world sometimes manufactured was sufficient justice, and sufficient was what you worked with. He sat across from Wren in a Fleet Street office 3 weeks after the dinner and reviewed the final disposition documents. "The Blackthorn estate claim," Wren said. "The financial records substantiate the deliberate manipulation. You have grounds for a formal restitution claim against Hardcastle's personal assets." Kayadrick looked at the documents. "I know. Will you pursue it?" He thought about the years between the ruin and now, the specific education of rebuilding from nothing, the disciplines it had required, the ruthlessness it had produced, the understanding of how things actually worked that a man who had inherited a functioning empire would never have been forced to acquire. He thought about his father's portrait and the specific cold lessons Adrian Vale had administered across a childhood, and whether those lessons had made him more capable or simply more armored, and whether the distinction mattered in any practical sense when the armor and the capability had produced the same results. He thought about the fact that what Hardcastle had taken from him had also, in the unintended logic of destruction, built everything he currently was. "No," he said. Wren looked at him. "Keep the file," Kayadrick said. "If Hardcastle's counsel attempts to mitigate his sentence by challenging the financial evidence, use it. Otherwise, close it." He set the documents down. "I don't want restitution from him. I want him held to account for what he did to Edgar Rowe's family and the dock workers and the people he used as operating leverage. That's what the file is for." Wren studied him for a long moment. Most men in my position, haven't spent 4 years learning that what you build from nothing is yours in a way that what you inherit never entirely is," Kayadrick said. "I don't need his money. I need the accounting to be accurate." He left the Fleet Street office and walked through the January streets without a carriage, which he occasionally did when he needed the specific clarity that cold air and physical movement provided. London moved around him in its winter register, vendors and carriages, and the particular rhythm of a city that was indifferent to the private dramas of its inhabitants in ways that Kayadrick had always found more honest than oppressive. He had built something. He had nearly lost it twice. Once to Hardcastle's patient destruction, and once to his own deliberate isolation from everything that might compromise his efficiency. He had survived both by methods he was still in the process of evaluating, and what the evaluation was producing was not a clean verdict, so much as a working hypothesis about the nature of survival itself. His father had believed survival required the elimination of vulnerability. Make yourself impervious and you make yourself safe. What his father had produced was a man who died alone, and a legacy that collapsed the moment the man who held it together by force of cold will was no longer there to apply that force. The structure required the constant application of isolation to maintain itself, which meant it was not a structure at all. It was an ongoing expenditure disguised as a foundation. Kayadrick had spent 4 years building something different. He had built relationships with people who had skin in the outcome. Lucien with his parallel loyalties and his imperfect transparency, Wren with his institutional agenda and his genuine commitment to the result, Voss who had been coerced and had told the truth about it when the cost of truth was still uncertain. He had built a trading empire on the logic that you earn loyalty by making the people around you invested in your success rather than dependent on your largesse. He had, in other words, built something that could survive him. He had just not, until very recently, been willing to apply that logic to the one area where it was most needed. He arrived at the Ravenshire townhouse in the middle of the afternoon. Evelyn answered the door herself rather than leaving it to the staff, which told him she'd been expecting him at approximately this hour, which told him she had mapped his patterns well enough to project them with reasonable accuracy. He found that information more affecting than he intended to. She looked at him in the doorway with the composed attention of a woman who had decided several weeks ago that she was done performing equanimity at the expense of the actual thing and was now in the process of developing equanimity that was actually structural rather than demonstrated. "You look like you've been walking," she said. "From Fleet Street." "That's not close." "No." She stepped back from the door and he came inside. The townhouse was warm and smaller than Blackthorn House, and organized in a way that suggested a person rather than an institution. Books in actual use, a coat left over a chair arm, the small evidence of a life being lived rather than maintained. He stood in the entrance hall and felt the specific quality of a place that had been chosen for habitation rather than impression. They went through to the sitting room and she poured 2 glasses of something that turned out to be a burgundy considerably better than the decanter suggested, and they sat across from each other in the winter afternoon light, with the particular ease of 2 people who have recently agreed to stop performing for each other and are still slightly surprised at how much room that agreement creates. "Wren closed the restitution file," Kedrick said. She looked at him. "Your instruction?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, not from surprise, but from the specific attention she gave things she was actually thinking about rather than managing. "How does that feel?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Lighter than I expected," he said. "I spent 4 years treating the ruin as something that required a specific kind of settling. I thought the settling was what I was building toward." He turned the glass in his hand. "It turns out the building was its own settling. The ruin taught me things I don't want restituted. I want him held to account. Those are different requirements." She looked at him across the winter light with the expression he had learned to identify as her paying attention in the full way. Not the social attention she was trained to deploy, but the actual quality of a person receiving something they find worth receiving. "You've changed," she said. "I've been changing for 4 years," he said. "The process has recently become visible. That's different." "Is it better?" He thought about the hallway at Whitmore House, the pistol barrel. The moment he had looked at Hardcastle and felt the specific smallness of a 30-year grievance, and understood, with a clarity that was almost uncomfortable in its completeness, that the thing which had organized someone's entire existence had never been large enough to hold the weight it was asked to carry. He thought about his father's portrait and the lessons administered through humiliation and the war and the rebuilt empire, and the 8 years of Evelyn Ravenshire, existing in the architecture of his life as a wound he insisted on treating as a closed account. "Yes," he said, "it's better." She smiled. It was a small smile, not performed for the room but produced by something specific and genuine, and it did the thing that her smiles had always done to the internal accounting, moved things around without asking permission. "I have a condition," she said. "Name it." "You talk to me," she said. "Not debrief me, not manage what I know. Not route information through the part of you that's already calculated what I can handle. You talk to me the way you talked in that anteroom. That version." He looked at her. "That version is considerably less efficient." "That version is the only one I'm interested in a long-term arrangement with," she said. "The efficient version can run your empire. I'm not asking to absorb your empire." He was quiet for a moment. "That is a workable condition," he said. Outside, the January light was doing what January light does in London. Failing earlier than expected, falling at angles that softened the edges of things without warming them. The city beyond the window continued its ordinary operations, entirely indifferent to 2 people in a sitting room deciding, with the seriousness that some decisions require, what to do with the rest of what they'd been given. Kedrick set down his glass and looked at Evelyn Ravenshire across the fading afternoon light, and he thought about his father's framework, that caring was vulnerability, and vulnerability was the mechanism of destruction. And he thought about the version of that framework he'd spent 4 years refining into something he'd called discipline, but that had functioned, in practice, as a more sophisticated version of the same error. The error was not caring. The error was believing that the cost of caring could be managed down to 0 through sufficient architecture. It couldn't. That was the thing no amount of reconstruction taught you until you ran the experiment the other way. The cost was fixed. The question was only whether you paid it consciously, or whether you paid it in the form of everything you refused to hold. He had refused to hold a great deal. He was done with the refusal. The fire in the grate worked steadily. The city outside moved through its winter evening. The snow had stopped for the moment, which in London meant nothing about whether it intended to return, and the sky over the rooftops held the specific pewter color of a season that was not yet ready to become something else. Caedric Vale, Duke of Blackthorn, who had come back from ruin richer than war and colder than grief, and dangerous enough to make powerful men nervous, sat in a warm room in the January light and let himself be simply present in it, not managing the outcome, not calculating the exposure, not preparing for the next position in a game he had been playing alone for long enough that the solitude had started to feel like strategy rather than loss. He was 31 years old. He had survived everything that was supposed to finish him. The account was not closed. It was, for the first time, open. Genuinely open. The way things are open when you stop treating them as liabilities to be contained and start treating them as the actual substance of a life. He looked at her. She looked back. The afternoon held them both, quiet and unremarkable and entirely sufficient.